Hola, hola, and welcome to Queer Indigenous Communities. And I'm so happy that you could be with us here today. Just gonna fix that up a little bit. And my name is Max Cisneros. Yo soy el Latinx program officer for the New Haven Pride Center in New Haven, in the in the state of Connecticut. And so I'm really happy and honored to have this space so we could talk about queer Indigenous identities and communities. And we have some awesome souls that can like join us and be able to flesh and explore this stuff out in ways where we could better understand how we can move on from land recognition. And so, first of all, let me just bring them right in. I want to introduce, if I may, first, Madeline Freeman. She goes by hers, and she's from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and from the sorry, that's Mackenzie, my bad. She's from Oklahoma City and from the sorry, a little wobble here. Choctaw and Chickasaw. I guess you would say tribes or land was the
Uh,
appropriate way. I'm gonna be wobbly here,
Nations.
so correct me. Say it again.
These are nations.
Nations. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation. We're gonna keep going with the introductions and then we're gonna go right into it if it's cool. Next, I'd like to welcome Mackenzie Denham, and goes by she, hers. She is from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, and I appreciate you also because you brought forth basically the a lot of the thinking that really kind of like sparked my interest about land recognition and what that means and how that's just a beginning. So I appreciate you for bringing that, and then kind of like putting that idea virus where it's grew. And now we're here. And so next up is Nolan, Arkansas. I appreciate you being here with us, Nolan. Nolan is a sophomore at Yale. They're Cherokee born and raised on unconquered land in Cherokee, ancestral territory near Western North Carolina. Um, Nolan is a becoming researcher in the field of Native and Cherokee studies, and you can follow him on Twitter. We're going to have that there. And any pronouns work for Nolan, and I really appreciate you being here with us today. Thank you. And so next, certainly not least, I appreciate you so much for being with us here from Chicago. I met her about a year ago, perhaps more, and that's Ms. Mister. And Ms. Mister is I'm pulling it up right here. Pronoun is pronounced Ms. Mister, and the sorry. So, darling, I can't seem to find the intro I had for you. Do you have to chip in and help me out on that one? Can you hear us?
I think you may be
Can you
muted.
hear us? I think you might. Yeah, I think you might be muted.
Hello.
There you go.
Hi.
Hello, there you are. I was hoping if you could, inform us a little bit more about, your name, pronouns, and where you are, and
Yeah,
well, yeah, just that, and then we'll go right to the conversation.
cool. Hi. I'm in Chicago. Miss Mister is the name I'm known by. I'm from New Mexico. I'm of mixed heritage. My father is Mexican and my mother is from Santa Clara and San Ildefonso Pueblo in the Southwest. I grew up there. That's where I'm from, and I live in Chicago now as an artist.
I appreciate you. Thank you. So this is a conversation that, started in September, and I'm really pleased that we can like move on into a space beyond land recognition, which is really what I was hoping this conversation could be about. My role will primarily be that of practicing curiosity and trying to understand a little bit more of what many folks don't necessarily understand. And so my first question would be centered around kind of like what about land recognition feels as though for a lot of folks it's a suitable place to end the conversation, and why is that harmful? And then we'll get into what are ways that we can move on from that. Like how can we break out of just stopping there? So I'm going to ask Madeline first, and then we'll just popcorn around.
Yeah, I guess it's just harmful to end at land recognition because I think that there's a lot of struggle even getting to land recognition for a lot of people. And I guess I'm saying that because once you recognize that you don't have like ancestral claim and that your claim to the land is through violence and genocide, then you kind of like put yourself into a corner, and that doesn't really work for like imperial bodies. And so yeah, I just think that it's like once you can get Yale and other places to like recognize that they're on specific communities' land, but since it's such a struggle to get to that point, they feel like it's a big accomplishment. I guess this is what I'm assuming, but they feel like it's a big accomplishment, and then that's enough. And that doesn't really do anything to like help the Quinnipiac and Paugussett people here in Connecticut, and the other Algonquin speaking people. And yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and pass it on.
Yeah, I think something I really like all those points that you made, Madeline, and I think just to add a helpful analogy that was presented to me one time is just this here. I'm not going to go this month to my landlord and simply acknowledge my rent and then like that be the end of the story. And I like that you brought up Yale into the conversation too, Madeline, because I think the history of like these institutions like Yale and colonialism just go far back, and they're so close hand in hand. Where Yale is one of it's just like a big like I guess imperial power that does and did a lot to remove Quinnipiac people, kill a lot of like native people and like relationships, harm like the waterways here, kill a lot of the native and indigenous like plants and animal species. And so yeah, you're right, like it's not really enough for an institution, for a state, for a place like Yale to be like, oh, I'm gonna acknowledge like this is like native land and that'd be the end of the story. I think Yale has responsibility, like you were saying, Madeline, to the Quinnipiac people. Like, y'all, like this institution removed a lot of Quinnipiac people, so now this institution has a responsibility to provide housing for Native and Indigenous people here. This institution did a lot to, harm and colonize like the plants and the animals, and so Yale has a big responsibility as far as like paying up for like the climate destruction that has taken place here. Yeah, so many things.
I would say that
Thank you. Yeah,
applies
there's a
to
lot around
any
there.
large group or any large institution that is on land that, is the territory of indigenous groups, because they function in a capitalist structure that provides them with compensation or ownership of buildings, land, any other resources that might be there, and those are funding an imperial structure. So I agree with both people who've spoken already that while on one hand, even hearing land recognition for me was such a new big thing, like, oh wow, they're actually recognizing what was here before, but that is just a starting point. And if you recognize where that land is and whom it is, under whose care it is, I think those institutions, a further step could be asking those people who they recognized in what ways they can benefit their present state, or what sort of reparations can begin regarding the present state of those nations.
Absolutely. That, yes, like I feel like all three of you have really hit it on the head. Speaking more to, I think, because I feel like we are all like in agreement, obviously, that well, perhaps obviously that land acknowledgement is simply the first step. I think maybe taking one step back and like speaking to the like issues that have arisen from the popularization of land acknowledgements in like the last year or two. I think for me too, like seeing land acknowledgements was initially amazing. It was very nice to finally see even a nugget of recognition, and hey, we're on Indigenous land, and it's this nation, and you know, for Yale, the Quinnipiacs, for Tulsa, you know, the Cherokees and the Osage Nation. So, which is where I am right now. So I think one of the things that comes up is that it is the first step, and but that also because it has been so popularized. I mean, not all encompassing, but within certain spheres has become so popularized, especially on social media, which we can debate a little bit about. It has the potentially become rather performative, and I think that potential for performativeness is what makes at least me, and I feel like other Indigenous people, so wary of, you know, mass like land acknowledgement and like proliferation of it, because as you know, Nolan, I like already said, like there is no next step. Like Yale has not taken, for example, Yale has not taken these next steps, and I mean, and kind of like a metaphor that, or an analogy that I think works rather well is like, or an example is that in certain schools in Canada, they are now having land acknowledgements every single day on morning announcements. And that initially amazing. Like you never see that really here, at least where I'm from. Like that's not like no, Mountain's like absolutely not. Yeah, we don't see that here. Even in Oklahoma, which is like traditionally like seen as like a natively populated space. And there's concern that like the children, you know, because they hear it every single day with their morning announcements with, I'm not sure if Canada does the Pledge of Allegiance like we do, but that like they're not understanding the meaning behind it, that it just becomes background noise. It has the potential to become background noise, that there is no lesson going with it of, so now this is what we're going to do today to reinforce those values to, you know, the next step is like action. That was a bit.
And you set it up just nice there, because I'm curious. No, I appreciate that, because that sets us up nice for us to begin to ask, so what is next? How can we move into action? How can we be intentional about what kind of actions to take in order to get beyond land recognition? And that gets to my next part here that I'd like to ask you, Nolan, is that what does it feel as though, because to me, part of that process, and I imagine a lot of people probably fell in this, was part of that process to understand, I think you put it in the kickoff private, revive the relationship with the land, revive our relationship with the land, and that'll get us closer to understand what happened and what we can do. Now that seems like a bit much. What I wanted to ask you, what is it about the relationships between your longevity of ancestry and the land, and even incorporate gender into that? What is it about the relationship with these, you know, these processes that can help us get to getting to a place beyond land recognition, to action?
Yeah, so I'm hearing just like a lot of curiosity from you. I'm hearing like a lot of, I guess, questions related to like, what is the history of gender and land and colonialism, and how do all these things kind of like tie in together, and like where can we move forward from them? Yeah, so I'd just like to say a few things. For me, colonialism is a process which removes the people from the land. And so I'm Cherokee, which has already been established. And I think for Cherokee communities, we believe very much so in fostering reciprocal relationships with the land, meaning every person would have a community role, from mother or farmer or protector, an artist, a storyteller, and not necessarily like a gender role. Yeah, and so with that, I think one big reason why Cherokee people were able to I think master like non-monogamy, gay relationships, gender fluidity, is because we embraced a form of Black Indigenous socialism where we determined that the most important relationship is that relationship between the people and the plants, the people and the local food systems, the people and the local animals. And yeah, so social roles and avenues to love were so wide open as long as we respected and gave back to the land that we call home. So land really to me is what produces our genders. Um, and, you know, like with the history of Spanish and English colonialism, again, it's the means by which the indigenous land relationships are severed so that the land and the people can be owned, can be sold, can be controlled. And I think people often don't realize that cisgender heterosexual social structure is very new wave in the Americas. You know, in the case of the U.S., we have the history of land grants, where a man, a white man, of course, was awarded a set of acres for him to settle. Well, then they said he gets more acres if he has a wife, and even more acres on top of that if he has children. And so, for me, this is a very critical and important change to land relations and gender in the Americas because it shows exactly how US policy literally creates heterosexuality in essence. I mean, settlers and indigenous people alike practice queerness, but official US policy mainly awards land, money, marriage, privilege to those who can produce this sort of like one man, one woman, two kids, and a dog type family unit. So yeah, for me, like the relationship to land is what constitutes our gender. And so long as settler states encourage us to think of land in terms of private property, and so long as settler states encourage those settlers who pervert the land into private property and kind of sustain further settlement through like a man and a woman heterosexual like type family unit. Yeah, so long as we sort of like live under those regimes, gender and land and like just all the relationships and all the community that kind of goes on here is like just going to be in a crisis.
I'm curious to know, Mister, if you have like, because we talked a little bit about this, not too much, but I was curious to know if like if there are those relationships when it comes to the land and gender, about how that settlers treated both of these concepts and how we still suffer from those socializations today. So I'm curious to know if there was anything you wanted to add about those relationships that we still see those dynamics happen today.
Yeah, I'm especially, you mentioned, Nolan, about, Spanish and English settlers. And, I'm a border child. And like I said, my father is Mexican. So I'm in a position to have a culture that embraces the Spanish language and be a part of a culture that has done the opposite of Spanish language and culture in many ways, you know. So, but one thing I do see among, at least in particular, my region, people within my region, is a continued connection to land that I think differs in different regions with different indigenous nations, as far as I know in the US. Because a lot of people where I'm from, whether they are native or not, do live and have a closer connection to the land in a way that I think is unique to the Southwest and people of the Southwest. Whether those indigenous people speak Spanish or any other language. I think Spanish actually, at least in my region, encompasses a greater number of indigenous groups that are not just necessarily Native American, because there are a lot of Mexican indigenous groups, indigenous peoples of Mexico who are a part of their culture, but then also speak Spanish. So there's like a wider variety of indigenous tradition that I think is land-based, that encompasses Mexico and what we know as the States today. And that relationship, given the, I'm going to say the agricultural history of the Southwest, creates a different relationship to land. And, I don't necessarily know the specifics, but I can, at least from what I know that that is not the case with Native groups in other parts of the United States. And I do think that's really in part of Spanish colonization really utilized the knowledge of agricultural practices of indigenous people to enhance their colonial power. They enslaved people to build and to farm in a method that we have used for tens of thousands of years.
Right. Yeah, and I would say that's pretty similar, like with colonization in other parts of the U.S. too, and even Canada. Everything that these imperials got, they got from indigenous people and they got from Black people. And like you said, like we taught them how to farm. We gave them every single bit of food that they eat. All of the, relations that we have with like the plants and the animals, they then consider them resources, and like everything that we built from the ground up, or everything that we built over, the course of thousands and thousands of years, like they just came over here and kind of like tried to profit off of it, and did profit off of it. Yeah, and medicine too, like every single bit of like, every single bit really of like modern medicine originally comes, from like indigenous plant medicine, from botany. There's like disinfectants, there's antibiotics, like we had it all figured out. Yeah, so it's just so true, like everything that you're saying.
Mm-hmm. And in particular, I think this time of year a lot about turkeys, which Pueblo people, which is my people, have used in a variety of ways. Before farming them for food, their feathers were a part of our culture, and we wore them, as a normal wear, especially in the winter. And now the turkey has become this whole other creature that is very special to, our nation. When I say the United States as a nation, or our traditions of Thanksgiving, but that itself even has a deeper tradition that isn't necessarily recognized. Instead, it's just slaughtered and eaten, So
Right.
in mass, like thousands and thousands of birds eaten on this supposed feast day. So I think it's a complex situation, but in particular, listening to, I think, the people who experience this and are affected is a start to the next step after land recognition. Like, what is the history of these things that you're recognizing? How are the people who you recognize continuing their traditions, and how can you aid them in doing that?
Mm-hmm. Something that I'm hearing in this conversation is
erasure is a huge part of why I believe people have the misconceptions. No, please go on.
No, go ahead. I think Micah.
You're good, Nolan. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. I was just going to say something that I think that we're kind of hitting on is this question of, like language and gender, and like Spanish and English, and like the effects of like Spanish and English colonialism, but more specifically the effects of like how we use language. And I know, Max, that you had a pretty interesting question in regards to like, Spanish speaking as resistance, and like you were thinking, that question that you had. And I know Madeline wanted to speak a bit on that. So,
oh yeah,
kind of like a natural transition. Yeah.
I thought that was a great question by Max, because where I'm from, a lot of Native people do not speak Spanish, even though many possess a Spanish last name. Spanish is not a language that is very rarely spoken. And I speak it because, part of my heritage is Mexican, and it's a part of that culture. But, I think actually, in my personal experience, I have never met a native person who speaks the language of Spanish, unless they happen to be like myself of mixed heritage. And I think that's probably different for someone who is maybe Spanish speaking, who doesn't have, like, maybe a Mexican person who might also be indigenous, but doesn't necessarily have a more specific connection to their native heritage and the history of the language within that community. I don't know. I guess this is where I really feel like we can dissect this particular point. And
Yeah.
like I said, I have a unique position in that, that I'd like to hear other points of view specifically. But I do know that in my region, Spanish is rarely spoken by Native people.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about it too. So I don't speak Spanish, and my first language is English, which is unfortunate. But I have been trying to learn my tribal language, Choctaw, since I was about 13. So it's been like 7 years or so. And it's kind of been like a long process for myself to do that. But when I came here to Yale, we have to do like a language requirement. And with the language requirement, you have to get 3 credits in a language, or you have to like place out of the language. And so I originally wanted to come in and take Choctaw because I was told that I could take Choctaw. And this didn't pan out, and they didn't offer Choctaw, and Yale doesn't offer any indigenous languages for credit. And so, like, in order for me to take Choctaw, I would have to find like a teacher and like be taught on my own and then place out of the class. But even this process wasn't really worked out. And so before, I was kind of like trying to figure out what exactly I would do. And I was really just like, I don't want to take French. I don't want to take Spanish. I don't want to take Portuguese, Italian. I don't want to take any of those languages because like I already speak English, and as like a native person, I just don't want to have that like double colonizer tongue. I just really don't want that. And that was kind of like a sentiment that was shared with other students at the Yale Native American Cultural Center, where they were also, a lot of us like were struggling and are still struggling with like our language requirements, because it puts us in this position where we either have to learn Spanish or Italian, which are like the big languages people take here at Yale, where we have to do that, or we have to find some kind of like ragtag way of getting like our tribal language credit, if even. And it's like, these are people who like, I think that there's like varying scales of like how related people are to their languages. So some people are coming in like learning for the first time, but there are also students here who have been speaking like Lakota since they were young, or speaking their languages from the Pueblo communities since they were young, and like want to be able to use what they already have and have that already be recognized on the same level as like Spanish or Italian is. But Yale just like doesn't make that happen. So yeah, I just think that like in a lot of ways, like definitely like as being somebody who's privileged to speak English in an English speaking country, that I like have the opportunity to not speak Spanish, and like I really just don't want to. But I also can see how like Spanish does become like a rebellious act, especially in the United States, when you have a lot of like Spanish culture become through like, the hundreds of years of colonization and assimilation, but Spanish culture become racialized and meaning indigenous people. Because coming from Oklahoma City, I went to a high school that was like 70% Hispanic. And so a lot of people spoke Spanish. And a lot of those people would also, a lot of students were undocumented, and a lot of students just had like varying backgrounds. Their parents only spoke Spanish and stuff. And they would tell me that, that is something that's really looked down on in Oklahoma City. Like a lot of people are like rude to their parents or, you know, unhelpful and stuff like that. And so I think in those like kind of scenarios, or at least in the United States, like speaking Spanish as an Indigenous person from Mexico, I think is like a lot more like an act of rebellion than in other contexts. I don't know if that like is a good way of phrasing that. But for myself personally, like speaking more colonial languages is just kind of terrible.
Yeah.
I really feel that a lot because I had recently started learning French, but I had learned it from a Cameroonian woman, because I she opened my eyes to the fact that, you know, the globe has been colonized and that people of color are speaking these colonial languages. And she became my tutor. You know, she's a Black woman from Cameroon. So now I've begun learning French and I've been studying now for a couple of years, but I really relate to you because I had been resistant to learning another language for the reasons that you're saying as well. So I would just want to say that in support of your statement for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really love everything that I'm hearing here today, especially Max, when you sort of bring up like what I guess does it mean to learn these colonial languages, and Madeline talking about this a lot too. And so I guess for me, I just like to add something which probably is pretty obvious by now. It's just like Spanish and English both are colonial languages. And so I've spoken a bit about this on Twitter, but it seems almost like academics and activists, we attempt to disrupt this gender binary in English and in Spanish by producing terms like folks with an X, Latinx with an X, woman with an X. But I think at some level, colonial and Christian languages will never be enough to fully disrupt like this gender binary. Why do I think that? Simply because colonial language is, to me, the thing which produces binary. Simply because these languages, work in terms of masculine and feminine. So, to me, Spanish and English both are languages which colonize by the gender in America simply because they speak the masculine and feminine binary into existence. For me, I speak Cherokee, and so I really do believe that so many Indigenous languages hold more, I guess, complex and inclusive vocabularies related specifically to gender and gender identity. Again, thinking back to Cherokee language, my culture doesn't really think in terms of like masculine and feminine because my ancestors simply didn't have those words. Um, and English then is really what introduced me to him and her and feminine and words that are sort of like binaristic like that. And so, yeah, English and Spanish are tongues that, again, colonizers forced onto Black and Indigenous people everywhere in the Americas. So, of course, like I never blame any of us for speaking English or Spanish, simply because it's like not really our choice. You know, like our schools speak it. Most places in South and Central America like speak Spanish. Most places, you know, like here, just anywhere in America, is like we're forced to speak colonial languages through boarding schools, through the government, through voting requirements, and the list goes on. That being said, I don't think that we ever should fully embrace colonial languages, which I don't think is something that any of you have said. I think that for me, like, I'll only truthfully be free from this sort of like linguistic gender binary when I speak Cherokee 24/7. And so for me, I think restoring gender inclusive terms in the Americas really comes down to restoring Indigenous languages. And just, it's important for us to realize, I think, like, that these languages aren't lost. And it's important for us to realize that there are more Indigenous languages in the Americas than there are foreign languages and colonial languages combined. I mean, they're really everywhere, and there's so many of them, and there's so many just language speakers and language communities that really need support right now. And I think one of the ways that the audience and for all the panelists here too is just to really, I guess, research Native languages and do our best to support them. And so one super simple way is to visit this website called native-land.ca, which I think, Max, you might be able to drop in the chat or on the screen. But this website is pretty cool, actually. You can enter in your zip code or just like the town where you live. And you can find like the treaty sign there. You can find whose ancestral land it is, but you also can find out which language is spoken in the land which you now call home. And so say you find out that Cherokee is the home language, say you find out that like Choctaw is the home language, you can then, just run a Google search that says like Cherokee language revitalization programs or, whatever language revitalization programs, and just do the research and see if there's a way that you can donate directly to like a language revitalization program, see if there's ways that you can, raise awareness around or support directly an Indigenous language community. And a lot of times there are ways for you to learn these languages online. And so I'd encourage you to check out, those online dictionaries and things of that sort.
Cool. I want to check that out personally for sure.
Also, if I may, so I kind of had a parallel experience to Ms. Mister's experience, where, in fact, I was exposed to much the opposite thing. In high school, I'm not Hispanic or Latina, but I had a great friend who is of the Aztec people and Mexican, of like dual descent. And so it was very interesting because she is indigenous. She is of the Aztec people. She's of the indigenous people of what's called Mexico. And it was very telling. And I feel like it goes so well with the conversation we've been having because she was never invited to the camps. She was never invited to the community building, the native community building, things that, other native kids from and native students from American native communities like Cherokee, Choctaw, Osage, and the like. She wasn't invited to those spaces because, it goes back to what the institution is defining as indigenous. We know she's indigenous, she knows it, and it's recognizable. But because the colonial institution of our high school and our school system didn't recognize the duality of, her heritage, as well as the fact that, there are indigenous people everywhere. There are indigenous people from Mexico. There are indigenous people from Brazil, from Chile, from everywhere. So it was a very hard thing because we connected on such a level across our indigeneity, but we were separated by the colonial institution in the community we were operating within. So I think for us as indigenous communities and indigenous individuals, it's important, non-Hispanic indigenous people, to make our spaces, when we can, inviting, to make our high school clubs inviting, to make our Native American cultural centers open to, and not for lack of a better word, gatekeep. I'm not sure if that's the best terminology, but gatekeep indigenous and native spaces, especially in colonial institutions, especially in traditionally colonialized spaces, because I feel like to not do that just permeates this colonial structure and separates, in almost on some level invalidates the indigeneity of my friend. She felt her indigeneity was being invalidated all the time because she was not considered indigenous. And so I think it's really important for non-Hispanic and non-Latina indigenous people to recognize that, and obviously for like, if we can, to make sure we have open conversations and acknowledgement.
Yeah, Mackenzie, I so love everything that you're saying right now. And it reminds me of a question that Max asked. And let's see, let me try to find it. He basically asks, so he says, as a Mexican, non-citizen immigrant to the United States regime myself, I can understand violent harms caused by assimilation. How can I learn to avoid taking on like this colonizer identity? And this is a question that really interested me, just because I don't think we talk about it enough. Like, I think like Native American is something that's like very centered in like the United States. But one thing that a lot of us don't really realize is that there are just multitudes of Black people and multitudes of Latinx people who have or had like very real Indigenous connections. And it's not to the fault of like Latino communities, and it's not to the fault of Black communities that those sort of Indigenous relationships like aren't like so visible right now. Because I mean, when we really think about history, like nobody asks to be displaced, and nobody asks for their language to be taken away, and nobody asks to be forced to speak, some sort of colonial language, or forced to engage in sort of in any of these like colonial or capitalist harmful systems that we're like damned to in the 21st century. And so yeah, like just tone in on what you're saying, Mackenzie, like I think Native American and Indigenous people today have a lot of work to do as far as reaching out to our Black relatives, reaching out to our Latinx community members as well, just because like Indigenous knowledge is powerful, and Indigenous land relations are powerful, and Indigenous languages are powerful. And it's our responsibility really to, I think, like share and learn from one another, and just be open to like all displaced and like colonized people. Yeah. So I don't think you're a colonizer, Max.
I really, I got the chills when you said that, Mackenzie, because when you were speaking on that topic, because I could feel that so much. Here in Chicago, actually, a lot of the powwows that are done here actually do include many Mexican people, which is an interesting that I've noticed here. Like last year, before the pandemic and social distancing, I went to Indigenous Peoples Day powwow, and there were many like, Native people, and then so many Mexican people as well in one powwow. And it was so powerful because I had personally never experienced that. My siblings and I, we go to powwows, like the Gathering of Nations, which happens in Albuquerque. So my siblings and I will go there and like have a ball. And that's exclusively, or not exclusively, I should say, it's primarily, Native American, people. And then here in Chicago, I found that there's more of a blend. And Max and I have talked about this, and one of the reasons why Max asked me to join was because one of my main areas of focus as an artist and a lecturer is about how, like you're saying also, Nolan and Madeline, about these, I feel like language has become a barrier to uniting Indigenous peoples on a wide scale, because where I'm from, that was once considered Mexico until the United States bought it. And then it became colonized by English speakers. So it was first, colonized by Spanish and then recolonized again by English. So we have all these different colonial powers that are not only changing ways of life through, enslavement and taking our methods of land appreciation, but also language, going from one colonial language to another and shifting identity in a really toxic way. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the reasons why I personally have made it a point to learn as many languages as I can. In particular, starting with Romance languages. Like I said, I've been studying French because I feel like I don't want to let any language be a barrier to connecting, because I know that there are people of color, indigenous people who speak French and speak Spanish. And where I'm from, there's actually an Indigenous Language Institute, which is in Santa Fe. It's actually on the Santa Fe Indian School, is what it's called, Santa Fe Indian School's property. And there people can learn languages. So I've been working on Kiowa, which is the language of the Southwestern people, or some of them. But this important point that everyone here is making is essentially, I feel like as Indigenous people, we want to connect with other Indigenous people, regardless of all these other barriers. And even just this conversation today is our next step beyond land recognition for us, as people creating these changes. So I appreciate what you said, because you really gave me chills, Mackenzie, when you were talking about that story.
Thank you so much. That means a lot to me, that my words are, a part of this space, and that they resonate on any level. And I think you're so right that it's on the flip side of not wanting to learn colonial languages, because it's colonial words are heavy on the tongue, as the saying goes. I don't know if anyone else has heard that, but the flip side of that is that colonialism and indeed colonial languages exists to separate Indigenous people from our culture and from our individual cultures. So I feel like maybe a silver lining, or something to think about and delve into a little bit, is the more colonial languages the more Indigenous people you can connect who have been separated from their culture, from themselves. I think that's a beautiful point.
Yeah, I agree. And I kind of just want to add to everything that has been said. I definitely I say I agree, and I totally was just I don't want to learn any colonial languages at all. But I think that that's a really interesting point, because it's yeah, it's just you can't. Now we're kind of just working in this weird era where we have to kind of use the tools that are given to us, while also investing in our own communities and stuff. But yeah, I just think it's just really interesting to kind of think about how a lot of the ways that Mexican indigeneity is erased, and I would even just push that even more so than indigeneity is in the United States context, just because for me, I already mentioned that I went to this high school where 70% of the students were Hispanic, but a lot of them are Indigenous looking, and more so than I am, which, sorry, that's a weird way to say it, but when we were in school, I was always the Native American, and I was always the Indian, and they nobody treated me bad, but they treated me different on that level, that because I was Indian and I had claim to this land, and they were just Mexican. And that's something that we've kind of talked about since then, is just how weird that is, that we're all Indigenous, and really the only difference is who colonized us, and just really how deep these colonial languages go, that children are voicing that, and helping fuel those divisions between our communities and stuff, where I just feel if we had, I don't know, the opportunity to be y'all are Indigenous, I'm Indigenous, we should kind of be banding together on that, rather than it just being I don't know, just spending all of my primary education being I am different where I'm not. And I think that that's just kind of in some ways it marks the success of the colonial mission, and just by pushing those divisions between us. But like Miss Mister is saying, is by kind of expanding our own knowledge base, that we are able to tap into these these bigger questions of what indigeneity means, and how we can band together.
Yeah.
And I'm also gagged by something Nolan said about how your language, or how colonial languages spoke into being this division and the power of language. So I wonder, okay, if we're identifying ourselves as Indigenous people, then is there an Indigenous language where we can recolonize each other and do away with all those European languages or something? Because our languages are powerful in that they just have a different way of creating a reality outside of a colonial mindset. So I appreciate that from you, Nolan, a lot. That the way you worded that really highlighted something, a new possibility in my mind.
Yeah, and sorry. I just wanted to also speak to Nolan's point earlier about like our languages and stuff and just kind of like the world that like English and Spanish has created for us. And like thinking about gender identity and stuff, in my language of Choctaw, we don't have a third person pronoun. So like if I'm referencing myself, I have a pronoun for that. If I'm referencing one of y'all, I have a pronoun for that. But if I was going to talk about some third person, the he, she, or it, there's no way to like say that in Choctaw. And I think that that's really kind of been like in reclaiming my language has really been something that's been very comforting for me, and like also learning and realizing my gender identity, of being like non-binary, but also she, they, confused. Like being like I just feel like I am able to like wrap my head around what I am experiencing in reality, in a way that like I wouldn't be able to in English because it's a she, he, she, they thing. Whereas in Choctaw, that's just not even like a question, that there is no he, she, or it. And it's, yeah, I think just like how important our Indigenous languages are in that sense is that they really do help us like think about the world in a non-colonial framework. And that colonial framework is kind of what is really mentally damaging to us.
Yeah, certainly. Like I know, like the Navajo word for other gendered person is nadli, which means changing, like a always changing person, you know. And in other Pueblo languages, there isn't necessarily a word for other gender because you're describing other characteristics of that person besides their gender. It doesn't exist in the same way as it may in English or Spanish or French. And yeah, I'm saying I personally want to make it a goal of mine to embrace Indigenous languages more than I personally have. But like I've described to you, is my goal in learning other languages was to connect with a broader group. Because I already connect with my people, you know, personally with English or whatever languages we're speaking, but broadening that. But I feel like this conversation is giving me life and pointing out some things. All of your points are really hitting on a lot of important shit that Max wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
I know that my Wi-Fi is real choppy, and y'all may not be able to understand. All of y'all being able to keep the conversation going. So I guess I wanted to ask y'all, this could be putting the cart before the horse, but I'm curious to know, what does reparations look like? I want to start envisioning what that may look like, because a lot of people are talking about that, but we may not necessarily have intention into it. So my question is, and popcorn, anybody can come up and answer, what does reparations look like?
Pueblo Revolt 2020. No, I'm joking. I was just bringing the history of the Pueblo Revolt in, but that was a bit of a joke. Someone else can answer because I got to think about it.
We love to see it. No, Pueblo Revolt 2020. Absolutely.
Shout out to the Pueblo Revolt. An amazing take against settler powers. An amazing success against settler powers. So iconic. Maybe this isn't a question. Well, I think two things. One thing, I think I already kind of spoke about this. we oftentimes acknowledge the land that we're on, and we oftentimes acknowledge the history of like labor and stolen labor in this country. But you're right, like there's no real like means of like repatriation going on. But there is such a need, right, for repatriations, and I think like specifically for Indigenous people, and just thinking of like Indigenous people in the Northeast, like again, there are all these big institutions like Yale, Harvard, the state of Connecticut, the state of New Jersey, who are all very responsible for killing a lot of Indigenous people and killing a lot of like, you know, plants and animals and just like all those relationships here. And so one key form of reparations, I think, for Indigenous people specifically is just that these institutions, like, one, have a responsibility to give the land back because they obviously don't know what the hell that they're doing with it. Two, a lot of Indigenous people are like poor and homeless, so that these institutions can exist, so that these states can exist. So for me, in order to remedy that, like these states and these institutions like have a responsibility to like, again, like give the land back, give up their space, give up their resources, so that all these displaced Native people can have a just like a place to live, and a place to like grow our own food. And two, I think it's important for us to acknowledge like the history of labor and stolen labor in this country. I know that there, for a long, long time, for I mean centuries, I guess, there's just been a movement for reparations for you know, like the descendants of African and African American like people who were enslaved. And so if anybody wants to do like more research on this, I know that there was a bill called HR 40, and it just had to do with just starting the conversation, starting the action teams that were related to like reparations for the African American community here, like in the so-called U.S. And I think, yeah, that's just like a really awesome conversation and a really important thing to think about, because it's like stolen land, stolen labor, the land needs to be returned, and all that stolen labor needs to be paid back in order for like us to keep moving forward, because otherwise it's just going to be like an exploitative, like non-reciprocal, white supremacist, like social set of like systems that we're living in.
Indeed. And oh, sorry, Nolan, were you?
And I think that's, yeah, maybe just real quick, the second point. I think a lot of what you're asking, Max, is like what happens after we acknowledge like this is Indigenous land and acknowledge sort of like Indigenous histories and like relationships. And what I kind of have hit on a lot is just like the responsibility that settlers have, the responsibility that colonizers have, the responsibility that these big, you know, settler institutions have for the Black people they exploited, for the Indigenous people they exploited. But a lot of times we don't really talk about like what are then the responsibilities of those who aren't colonizers. What are the responsibilities of those who were displaced, you know, by imperialism, displaced by global capitalism, displaced by like the institution of slavery. And so I'm just thinking back to this quote by Audre Lorde, and she says simply that without community, there is no liberation. And this is something that I think all of us have hit on today, is just that I think our responsibility as displaced people, as colonized people, as Black people, as, you know, Latinx people, as Indigenous people, is just to connect with each other, and is just to respect all of our differences, but also come together and embrace them, continue to organize, continue to support each other. It's rough out here, but yeah, I think we're getting there. And this conversation, I think, is one way that we can, I guess, begin to kind of like form that community. Yeah, Mackenzie.
That's, oh my gosh, Nolan, very eloquently put. Like, definitely, like, intersectionality of reparations is real. And, you know, like, there are so many communities that have obviously tragically and unfortunately been exploited and abused by, you know, the colonial state and like colonialism and imperialism, and thus like has created these multiple different communities and like intersectional communities that like deserve and need reparation. And I think that reparations, sorry, my dog is barking. I think the reparations are going to look different for different I don't know if you can hear him, but he's going off. But but reparations are going to look different for each group that, you know, you're approaching. Each tribal nation even may like seek something different. May each indigenous person may see reparations in a different light. So it's important to recognize that it not all or at least for me, I think it's important to recognize that not all reparations are going to look the same. Like the reparations that, for example, Yale needs to do and still has, you know, work to do is going to look different than, you know, for instance, like this lovely conversation. Like this is a form, for me at least, like of reparation. Like it's the next step is like continuing the conversation, making space for like these kind of communities and these kind of connections. And indeed, like I think that it's also something that I've noticed that something that's important for me to comment on is like decolonization is not a metaphor. Like land back is not a metaphor. I think that that is getting lost, not in this conversation, but in a lot of other conversations that I've heard. And decolonization is really not a metaphor. And like you cannot, or like people can't just like, for instance, for example, like recently, like how to decolonize Thanksgiving was like a huge thing going around. And I'm like, actually, it's not a metaphor. Like you can't just like say, oh, I'm not eating turkey today because like today I picked to be like an ally. Like it's, I think like, again, like very dangerously performative in that like, when we say like reparations, it's reparations. Like you, and if, and I think this conversation is a great example of this. I think, example of reparations to like our Afro-Indigenous and Black brothers and sisters out there is like on Juneteenth. I know people would just personally Venmo, you know, like Black and Afro-Indigenous people they knew just as like a personal form of reparations. Like I'm not saying that like you have to do that. I'm just saying that that's a personal example of something I've witnessed in just like this very hopeful, very positive like thing that I've seen. People want to make reparations. People like different people in different communities want to say, hey, I'm here for you. Like, let's get the ball rolling. And I think that's really just inspiring. And it gives me hope for like the next steps. And if there's like one more thing that I might like hit on is that there's ways, depending on where you live and depending on what tribal nation land you're residing in, there is actually ways for you, like for a person to pay taxes on their owned land to their tribal nation. So I think that if there's anyone like watching this in the audience or that is interested in their direct, you know, cause effect, that they may look into that as well.
Yeah, I think you're muted, Max.
Thank you, Mackenzie, for offering that. That's something that I didn't know. There we go. I appreciate that. Yeah, I just I didn't know that, and I thank you for offering that. We'll also share links to be able to understand that a little more. I appreciate that, and so I want to respect folks' time, and also speak as little because I know my Wi-Fi is choppy. So how about instead of closing, not closing, but we'll say continuing statement, not a closing statement. So if we wanted to make a continuing statement about how we feel about the healing part of this or how we want to move forward. And so I'll just go around here. Ms. Mister, if you'd like to start about any kind of continuing statement about where we go from here or what you found feeling from this conversation.
I think continuing to bridge the gap between all Indigenous people and empowering our sovereignty is my continuing statement.
Mm.
And that's it.
I think for me, I'm definitely interested in like absolutely like, you know, continuing this like conversation, trying to get like build connections and like further like delve into the intersection of like Hispanic indigeneity, Afro indigeneity, and like see what kind of doors we can open there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I am also just hoping to have more conversations where we really break down what indigeneity means and include displaced Indigenous people and Afro Indigenous people, and yeah, really just kind of like building like more, I think more networking between our like thousands of communities is just going to be super important. And I think that in this conversation, I've learned a lot and I've just appreciated having this space. And yeah, I think just little moments like this are really big in the end of the day.
I really love everything that everyone has had to say today. I think in closing, I just want to give a shout out to my community members, give a shout out to all the Black and Indigenous trans family members we have today, anyone who identifies as queer, you know, any, I guess, member of the LGBTQ community, specifically those who are like Black and Indigenous. I've been thinking a lot about how when we look back at how we're limited, when we look back at our own histories, how we're limited in the ways that we're able to look back on the histories of our communities and specifically the history of like queerness in our communities. A lot of times, and this is something that Kim Tallbear, who's a Dakota professor of like Indigenous Studies and Science, says, is that we have to attribute sometimes harmful or sometimes offensive words when we talk about like our Black and Indigenous ancestors. And so I think I really want us to all kind of think about like what does queer even mean? And I think like denotatively, it's a term attributed to those who differ from, you know, like what's considered normal in terms of gender and sexuality. I think cisgendered heterosexual people are always kind of centered as like the norm, whereas the regular. So then queer people are often regarded as those who are not straight or not cisgender or simply those who are different from. And just thinking back to like Cherokee culture, like there's no real way to translate like gay or lesbian or transgender or queer. And so I think like, yeah, I've just run into this sort of issue, you know, with like people that I talk to on Twitter, people that I talk to just like here and there, is just that we oftentimes like feel pretty limited in the ways that we are made to categorize ourselves as queer, as trans, as gay, as lesbian. And yeah, I just think we're limited in like English or Spanish, just these colonial languages. It's like hard for us to really truly like express ourselves in a way that we would have like if we still like we're very much connected to like our ancestral languages and lands. And so I just want to say like if you're confused about your pronouns, if you're confused about like your sexuality, if you're confused about your gender, if you struggle finding the right terms in English, that really, really describe you or really, really fit you and your identity, just know that you're not alone, because honestly, like a lot of these terms that like activists and like academic spaces use as far as like queer and trans and like LGBTQ people go, like it doesn't, they're not all encompassing. And so yeah, like gender, sexuality, it's all like an ever fluid process for every individual. And yeah, again, like it's hard out here. We're trying to find our way, but just know that like, yeah, it's all gonna work out.
Amen.
Yeah.
And
For
shout out
reals.
to Max. And shout out to Max for facilitating this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Max.
Thank you so much.
appreciate you, Matt.
And it was nice to
I
meet you,
appreciate y'all so much. I
Mr.
appreciate y'all, and thank you for bearing with the technical issues. Y'all handled it nonetheless. I appreciate you all very much for being part of this, for bringing your energies and continuing the conversation. So thank you all so much for joining us. This will be an ongoing conversation, and I appreciate every single one of you that joined us and made comments too. Until next time, muchas gracias y hasta luego.